It was 11:47 p.m. when my boss called me. Not a text, not a formal email. A direct call. I stared at her name on my screen, Isabella, for 3 full seconds before answering. In 2 years of working for her, she had never once reached out after office hours. To the rest of the world, Isabella was a titan. She was the woman who could silence a room with a single glance and manage a billion-dollar portfolio without breaking a sweat. Marcus. Her voice caught me off guard. It wasn't the sharp, controlled tone that dictated terms in boardrooms. It was quieter, thinner, almost fragile. "I need you to come to my place," she said. I sat up slowly, the silence of my apartment suddenly feeling heavy. "Is there a problem with the merger? I can be at the office in 20. "No," she interrupted. A pause followed. The kind of silence that carries a physical weight. I don't want to be alone tonight." I didn't ask questions. I didn't check the time. I just grabbed my keys. The rain was already beginning to lash against the windshield by the time I pulled into her driveway. A relentless, cold downpour that blurred the lines of the world. She opened the door before I could even raise my hand to knock. The woman standing there was not my boss. Same face, same striking eyes, but the armor was gone. No tailored suit, no heels. Just Isabella, standing in the dim hallway light, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders, looking at me as if I were the only anchor left in a storm. She looked at me and said nothing. She didn't have to. The curiosity of why I was here was eclipsed by the realization that, for the first time, she was letting me see the person behind the title. I stepped inside. The house was warm, but not in the way that feels intentional. It was the kind of warmth that comes from a place that has been lived in, where the lights are dimmed not for ambiance, but because someone forgot to turn them up. A half-empty cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, long gone cold. A throw blanket was bunched at one end of the sofa, the kind of evidence that someone had been sitting there for a long time, trying to hold themselves together. I had imagined Isabella's home 100 times without meaning to. You work closely with someone for 2 years, you build assumptions. I expected sharp lines. Minimalist furniture. Everything in its precise place, like a reflection of the woman herself. What I found instead was a home that breathed bookshelves that were slightly too full. A framed photograph on the wall, a younger Isabella, laughing openly at something outside the frame, her head thrown back, completely unguarded. A pair of slippers abandoned in the middle of the hallway floor, as if she had simply stopped walking at some point and forgotten to care. I looked at those slippers for just a moment longer than I should have. She caught me. "Don't," she said quietly, a faint trace of something, embarrassment maybe, crossing her face. "I didn't say anything," I replied. "You were thinking it. I was thinking your tea is cold." I nodded toward the cup on the counter. "Do you want me to make a fresh one?" She blinked. Like the simplicity of the question had somehow disarmed her more than anything complicated ever could. She nodded once and moved to sit at the kitchen island, pulling the sleeves of her oversized sweater down over her hands. I moved around her kitchen quietly, finding the kettle, the mugs, the tea bags. Not because she directed me, but because I paid attention to things most people overlooked. I had made her tea at the office before. Earl Grey. No sugar. A small habit I had quietly filed away without ever acknowledging that I had done so. The kettle began to hiss softly. "My mother called today," she said. Her voice was flat, measured, but the kind of measured that takes real effort to maintain. I didn't turn around. Something told me she would speak more freely if I wasn't watching her. "She had a fall this morning. She's stable now. They said she's stable." But I was in a board meeting when it happened. I was sitting in that room talking about quarterly margins while my mother was on a hospital floor. The kettle clicked off. I poured slowly. I didn't find out until 4 hours later. A pause. 4 hours, Marcus. I set the mug in front of her and sat down across the island. She was staring at the surface of the tea, her fingers wrapped around the mug, her knuckles just slightly pale from the grip. I booked the first flight out tomorrow morning, she continued. But tonight, she exhaled. A long, quiet release of breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything she hadn't let herself feel yet. Tonight I just couldn't be in this house alone with that. I nodded slowly. So you called me. She looked up then, and for a moment something flickered across her expression. A quiet vulnerability, raw and unscripted. You're the only person I know, she said carefully, who doesn't need me to be fine. The words landed somewhere deep and stayed there. I had worked alongside Isabella through product launches, corporate crises, and boardroom battles. I had watched her be relentless, brilliant, and at times genuinely intimidating, but in 2 years, I had never once heard her say anything that honest. How is she? I asked. Your mother, stubborn, Isabella said, and there it was, the smallest, most reluctant smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Absolutely impossible. She called me from the hospital bed to complain about the food. A soft breath of laughter. She said the soup tasted like warm disappointment. I felt a grin break across my face before I could stop it. Warm disappointment. I respect that level of specificity. She's been perfecting her complaints for 72 years, Isabella said, the smile lingering just a second longer now. She's very committed. Clearly you come by it honestly, I said. Keeping my voice completely straight, she looked at me sharply, and then, despite herself, despite the evening, despite everything, she laughed. A real one. Brief and surprised and entirely unguarded. It was the first time I had ever heard Isabella laugh like that, like she had simply forgotten, for just one moment, to be anything other than herself. The rain pressed against the windows. The kitchen was quiet and warm. And somewhere in the space between her cold tea and her reluctant laughter, I felt the first, almost imperceptible shift, like a door that had always been locked had just moved, barely, on its hinges. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. An hour passed without either of us noticing. That was the strange thing about it. With Isabella, time at the office always felt accounted for, scheduled, structured, divided into productive units. But sitting in her kitchen, the rain still hammering the windows, and the second round of tea going warm between us, time had simply dissolved. We had talked about her mother, about the hospital, about how Isabella had sat in the back of a cab on the way home from the office and spent 40 minutes on hold with the airline, refusing to let herself cry until the call connected. Did you? I asked. Cry, when it connected. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. I got very close, she said finally. That counts, I told her. It absolutely does not count, she replied. But the corner of her mouth betrayed her. Somewhere around midnight, she stood, stretched her arms above her head, and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just remembered they are supposed to be composed. You should stay, she said. The words came out practical, almost clinical, her armor sliding back into place reflexively. The storm isn't letting up, and you've been drinking tea for an hour. There's no reason to drive in this. I wasn't planning to argue with that, I said. She nodded once, satisfied that the decision had been made efficiently. The sofa pulls out. There are blankets in the cabinet beside the hallway. It should be comfortable enough. She said it the way she might assign a task at the office. Clear, direct, final. Then she turned toward the hallway, clearly considering the matter settled. Not on the sofa, I said. She stopped. A beat of silence filled the room, the kind that has texture, that you can almost feel against your skin. She turned back slowly, one eyebrow arching with the precision of someone who was very used to being the most composed person in any room. I beg your pardon? I kept my expression completely steady. The pull-out sofa. I've seen it. It has a bar directly through the middle of the mattress. Anyone who sleeps on that wakes up feeling like they've been folded in half. I tilted my head slightly. I've had my back out for a week before from one of those. I'm not doing it again. A pause. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but something in her eyes was reassessing me with visible amusement. "Is that so?" she said, not quite a question. "That's so," I confirmed. "And what exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" Her voice carried the faintest edge of something, not quite a warning, not quite an invitation, something that lived precisely between the two. "The guest room," I said, completely straight-faced. "You have one. I've dropped off documents here before, remember? Left side of the hallway. The door with the slightly temperamental handle." Another pause, longer this time. And then Isabella. My sharp, untouchable boardroom commanding boss pressed her lips together to suppress a smile and looked away briefly, as if she needed a moment to compose herself. "The handle is not temperamental," she said finally. "It requires a specific technique. I'll figure it out. You'll have to lift it slightly before you turn," she said, with the gravity of someone explaining a corporate strategy. "Otherwise it sticks. See, now I'm genuinely invested in this door," I said. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and whatever had been building quietly behind her eyes all evening settled into something I couldn't fully name. It wasn't discomfort. It wasn't disapproval. It was something softer and considerably more dangerous than either of those things. "Good night, Marcus," she said quietly. "Good night, Isabella." She turned and walked down the hallway. I watched her go, noting the exact moment her posture, which had been slowly loosening all evening, straightened just slightly as she moved away. Like muscle memory, like a reflex she hadn't quite been able to switch off entirely. But just before she reached her bedroom door, she paused. Without turning around, she said, "The guest room has an extra blanket on the top shelf of the wardrobe, in case you get cold." She knew I would need it. She had already thought about it. I stood in her kitchen for a moment after her door clicked shut. The rain still loud against the glass. Something warm and quiet settling in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. I lifted the guest room handle slightly before turning it. It opened perfectly. If you're already feeling something between these two, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have taken the sofa? I didn't sleep for a long time. Not because the guest room was uncomfortable. It wasn't. The mattress was generous. The extra blanket exactly where she said it would be, and the rain had softened from its earlier violence into something quieter and almost rhythmic against the window. Everything was fine. I just couldn't stop thinking about the way she had laughed in the kitchen. That brief, unguarded, completely unscripted laugh that had lasted maybe 3 seconds and had somehow rearranged something in my understanding of who Isabella was. I had worked beside this woman for 2 years. I had seen her dismantle flawed proposals with surgical precision. I had watched her walk into rooms where everyone was against her and walk out having changed 3 minds before lunch. But I had never seen her laugh like she had forgotten she was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns the rain made through the curtains, when I heard it, a sound from the kitchen. Quiet and careful, the specific sound of someone trying very deliberately not to make noise. I checked the time. 2:14 a.m. I got up. She was standing at the kitchen counter in the dim light of the range hood. Her back to me, both hands wrapped around a mug. Her hair was slightly more disheveled than it had been earlier. She was wearing the same oversized sweater, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had been sitting with their thoughts for too long and had finally needed to move just to escape them. She heard me and turned. For just a fraction of a second, before her composure caught up with her expression, I saw it, the red rim around her eyes. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet, private evidence of tears she had shed alone, in her room, where no one was supposed to see. "I was going to make tea," she said simply. "The kettle's already warm," I told her. "I'll do it." She didn't argue. She just turned back to the window, watching the rain. And I moved around her kitchen again in the easy silence that had somehow established itself between us over the course of the evening. You should be sleeping, she said, without turning around. So should you, I replied. A quiet beat. Fair point, she conceded. I set her mug beside her and leaned back against the counter, close enough to be present but far enough to give her the space to be whatever she needed to be right now. She stared into the tea for a moment, then spoke. I called her again after I went to my room. My mother. A small pause. She answered on the second ring, which means she wasn't sleeping either, but she told me she was fine and that I was fussing. Isabella's mouth curved slightly. She said, and I quote, "Isabella, I fell." I didn't dissolve. I felt the laugh leave me before I could moderate it. She sounds extraordinary. She is absolutely exhausting, Isabella said warmly. She is the most exhausting person I have ever known, and I would burn the world down for her. The honesty of it, the simple, ferocious love packed into that sentence, hit me somewhere unguarded. She said it without drama, without performance. Just truth, stated plainly in a quiet kitchen at 2 in the morning. I looked at her profile in the low light. The sharp lines that defined her in every professional setting were still there, but softened now. Like a photograph that has been slightly overexposed, revealing details that are usually lost in the contrast. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You're going to regardless," she replied, but not unkindly. "Why is it always so hard for you to let people help you?" The question settled in the air between us. She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might deflect, might reach for the armor she had been slowly, reluctantly setting down all evening. Instead, she turned and looked at me directly. "Because," she said slowly, like she was finding the words as she went, "every time I have, they've mistaken it for weakness, and then they've used it." She paused. "Every single time." The weight of that sentence filled the room. I didn't respond immediately. I let it exist, let her feel that I had heard it without rushing to fix it or minimize it. "I haven't," I said finally, quietly. "In 2 years, I haven't." She held my gaze for a moment that stretched just past comfortable and into something else entirely. Something honest and uncharted, and faintly terrifying for exactly that reason. Then she looked down at her tea. "No," she said softly, "you haven't." The rain continued its quiet rhythm outside. Neither of us moved, and in that stillness, in the dim light and the warmth and the fragile, extraordinary honesty of 2 a.m., I felt it with a clarity I could no longer explain away. This was no longer just a late night. This was the night something changed. And from the way she was very carefully not looking at me, I suspected she felt it too. This moment right here, this is the kind of connection most people spend years looking for. If this story is hitting different for you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a 2 a.m. conversation that changed everything? She left for the airport at 5:30 a.m. I know because I was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee I had made from the machine that took me 4 minutes to figure out. It had more buttons than her office phone. When she appeared in the hallway, her luggage handle in one hand, her coat folded over her arm, every inch of her reconstructed. The armor was back, tailored blazer, hair pulled back with that specific precision that left no room for interpretation. She was Isabella Marsh again, complete, composed, and untouchable. And if I hadn't been sitting in her kitchen at 2 a.m., watching her hold a mug with both hands to keep them steady, I might have believed it entirely. She stopped when she saw the coffee. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I replied, pushing the second mug toward her side of the table. She sat down, just for a moment. She wrapped her hands around the mug. The same gesture as last night, the same quiet tell, and looked at me across the table with an expression that existed somewhere between gratitude and something she hadn't yet decided to name. "Thank you," she said, "for last night. You don't need to thank me, Isabella." "I know that too," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." A beat of silence between us, warm and slightly fragile, like the last few seconds of a song you don't want to end. Then her phone buzzed, then her watch, Then the car she had called appeared in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the early gray morning. She stood, pulled on her coat, and paused at the door. "Lock up when you leave," she said, then quieter, almost as an afterthought, almost as something she hadn't fully planned to say, "I'll see you when I'm back. Not see you at the office. Not I'll be in contact. I'll see you when I'm back." I turned that sentence over in my mind the entire drive home. She was gone for 3 days. The office without Isabella was like a theater without a lead. Everyone still moving, still performing their functions, but with a particular aimlessness that no one quite acknowledged. I kept my head down, managed the files she had left me, answered the emails I had authority over, and flagged the rest. And I said nothing. About the night, about the kitchen, about any of it. Which is precisely why I was completely unprepared for what happened on the morning she returned. I was at my desk when Daniel Ford stopped beside it. Daniel was senior account manager, polished, well-connected, and possessed of the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no. In a way, he fully accepted. He had made his interest in Isabella known through a series of carefully placed professional gestures. Always the first to volunteer on her projects, always positioned in her eyeline during meetings, always ready with a comment designed to remind the room that he existed. She had never once given him a reason to believe it was reciprocated. That, I had quietly come to understand, was the problem. He set both hands on the edge of my desk, leaned forward slightly, and smiled. "Big night last week, apparently." I looked up from my screen. "Sorry, you stayed at Isabella's." He said it lightly, conversationally, the way you might mention the weather. But his eyes were doing something entirely different. The whole night. Just the two of you. He tilted his head. "Interesting." The air around my desk changed temperature. "Her mother was in the hospital," I said, keeping my voice level. "She needed someone to—" "Oh, I'm sure," Daniel said smoothly, straightening up. "I'm just saying, people notice things. People talk." He adjusted his cufflink with practiced ease. And in an office like this one, a story like that, he let the sentence trail off with the deliberate skill of someone who knew exactly how much damage an unfinished sentence could do. He walked away. I sat very still for a moment, and staring at my screen without seeing it. Because I understood, with absolute clarity, what had just happened. Daniel Ford had not come to my desk to make conversation. He had come to deliver a warning. And from the way he had smiled, measured, satisfied, and just slightly too calm, I suspected the damage was not coming. It had already been done. This just got complicated. If you've ever had someone deliberately try to sabotage something real and good, you know exactly how this feels. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done when Daniel walked away? I found out the extent of it by noon, not from Isabella. Not from HR. From the particular quality of silence that moves through an office when something has already been decided before most people arrive at their desks. The kind of silence that has corners, that bends around doorways and stops when you enter a room. People were looking at me differently, not everyone. But enough. By 11 o'clock, I had received 2 separate, just checking in messages from colleagues who had never once checked in before, and I had watched Daniel Ford spend 40 minutes in the glass-walled meeting room with Richard Calloway, the division's senior director, and the one man in the building whose opinion shaped careers with the casual finality of weather. I didn't know exactly what Daniel had said. I didn't need to. The architecture of it was clear enough. He had taken something private, something that had existed in the quiet, rain-soaked honesty of a personal crisis, and he had rebuilt it into something else entirely. Something that raised questions about professionalism, about judgment, about the nature of the relationship between a senior executive and the man who worked directly beneath her. Isabella walked in at 12:15. She looked rested in the way that people who have not slept properly try to look rested, the effort almost invisible. but present if you knew what to look for. She moved through the office floor with her usual composure, acknowledged the necessary people with the necessary precision, and did not look at me, not once. I told myself it was deliberate, professional, smart even, given whatever had already circulated. But there is a specific quality to being deliberately not looked at by someone who previously looked at you differently, and it settles in the chest in a way that is difficult to reason away. She was in her office with the glass blinds drawn for most of the afternoon. At 3:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. A meeting, her office. 4 p.m., no subject line. I knocked at exactly 4 o'clock. "Come in." She was standing at the window when I entered, her back to me, looking out at the city with her arms loosely crossed, a posture I recognized as the one she adopted when she was managing something internal, before she was ready to speak. I closed the door behind me and waited. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, without turning. "I'm fine, standing." A pause. She turned then, and I studied her face with the attention of someone who had recently learned to read its quieter signals. Her expression was composed, deliberately, painstakingly composed, but around her eyes there was something tight and overworked. "There are conversations happening in this building," she began carefully, "that I am not going to dignify with detail, but I need you to understand that they have implications. For both of us. And particularly for you." "I'm aware," I said. "Then you understand why I think it would be appropriate to." She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "To establish some professional distance, temporarily, while I manage this." The word temporarily was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and we both knew it. "Isabella." I said her name quietly, not her title, not professionally. Just her name, the way I had said it in her kitchen, and I watched something flicker behind her careful composure. "Who told Calloway?" Her jaw tightened fractionally. "It doesn't matter who. It was Daniel," I said. The silence confirmed it faster than any word could have. "He came to my desk this morning," I continued. "Before you arrived. He wasn't subtle. He wanted me to know that he had done it." Something moved across her face, not surprise, but the particular expression of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed and finds no satisfaction in being right. "All the more reason," she said quietly, "to be careful." "Or," I said, keeping my voice steady, "all the more reason not to let him decide what this is." She looked at me sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting this is, Marcus?" Her voice carried its professional edge again, sharp, measured, a warning wrapped in a question, and here it was. The moment I had been moving toward since a rainy night, and a kitchen and a door with a temperamental handle. I could retreat. I could nod, say understood, and walk back to my desk and let Daniel Ford have exactly what he wanted. Or I could tell the truth. "I'm suggesting," I said carefully, "that whatever happened the other night was real, and that you know it was. And that the only person in this building who genuinely benefits from you pretending otherwise is the man who walked into Calloway's office this morning." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Isabella stood very still, her arms uncrossed slowly. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, not in boardrooms, not in crises, not even in her kitchen at 2 a.m. It was the expression of someone standing at the exact edge of something and trying to decide, with every rational tool available to them, whether to step forward or step back. Her phone rang. She glanced at it. Calloway's name on the screen. She looked back at me, and for just a fraction of a second, barely a breath, her composure cracked. Then she answered the phone. "Richard," she said smoothly. "Yes, I'll be right there." She set the phone down, straightened her blazer, and walked toward the door, toward me, stopping close enough that I could see the exact effort it was taking her to hold the mask in place. "Give me until tomorrow," she said, so quietly it was almost only breath. "Please." Then she walked out, and I stood in her empty office, the city sprawling indifferently outside the window. wondering whether tomorrow was a promise or a goodbye. Tomorrow came quietly. No storm this time. Just a pale, clear morning that arrived without drama. The kind of day that offers no atmosphere, no convenient metaphor. Just clean light, and the ordinary business of the world continuing regardless of what you are feeling inside it. I arrived at the office at my usual time. Made coffee at my desk. Opened my files. Performed the motions of a normal morning, with the careful concentration of someone whose entire attention was actually fixed on a glass-walled office down the hall. Isabella was already there when I arrived. She was always there before everyone else. That had never changed. But this morning she wasn't on the phone or reviewing documents or doing any of the things she was usually doing when I glimpsed her through the glass. She was simply sitting at her desk, both hands flat on the surface in front of her, looking at nothing in particular, like someone who had made a decision in the night and was now sitting very still inside it. At 9 a.m., she called a full team meeting, not unusual in itself. Isabella ran a tight, structured calendar, and team meetings were a regular fixture. But something about the tone of the notification, sent to the entire floor, including Richard Calloway's assistant, made the morning feel like it had shifted onto a different axis. I took my seat in the conference room along with everyone else. Daniel Ford positioned himself, as always, with the practiced casualness of someone who had choreographed his own presence. 2 seats from the head of the table. Perfectly visible, perfectly placed. Isabella walked in last. She set her folder on the table, looked around the room with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed nothing because they had decided that rehearsing was no longer the point, and she spoke. "Before we begin the agenda, I want to address something directly." Her voice was clear and even, not loud, not performative, just completely disarmingly honest. There have been conversations in this office over the past several days regarding my personal life. Specifically, regarding a night when I called a trusted colleague for support during a family emergency. The room was extraordinarily still. "I want to be transparent," she continued, "because I believe transparency is the only response worth giving to something that was designed to make me feel ashamed of needing help." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I am not ashamed." I was watching her. I could not have looked away if I had tried. "What I am," she said. And here something shifted almost imperceptibly in her voice. Something that was not unprofessional, but was undeniably and completely human. "Is grateful. For someone who showed up without being given a reason, who made tea he knew I needed, and who did not once mistake my vulnerability for weakness." She looked at me then, directly, in front of every person in that room. "That is not a scandal. That is decency. And I will not allow it to be framed as anything else." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Daniel Ford was very still in his chair. The particular stillness of someone whose carefully constructed narrative has just been gently, publicly, and irrevocably dismantled. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The architecture of his strategy had required her silence and her shame, and she had simply refused to provide either. Richard Calloway, to his credit, nodded once, slowly, with the expression of a man who had just reevaluated something and found his previous assessment wanting. The meeting continued. But everything was different. Afterward, I was at my desk when I heard her voice behind me. "Marcus." I turned. She was standing in the space between our offices, not performing anything, not managing anything. Just standing there in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, looking at me with an expression that was the quietest and most honest thing I had ever seen on a human face. "The guest room door," she said. "The handle." I felt something loosen in my chest. "I remember. You lifted it before you turned it." The corner of her mouth moved. "I heard it from my room." "You were listening," I said. "I was paying attention," she corrected softly. "There's a difference." I stood up slowly. "Isabella, I'm not good at this," she said, with a directness that was somehow both her most professional and most personal quality combined. I want you to know that going in. I am not easy. I work too much, and I hold things too tightly, and I have spent a significant portion of my adult life convincing myself that needing people is a liability. She paused. But I have also spent the last 48 hours thinking about a man who found my mother's complaints about hospital soup genuinely funny. Who made coffee at 5 in the morning without being asked. Who told me the truth in my own office when it would have been considerably safer to say nothing. She took one step closer. So I am choosing, she said quietly, not to be afraid of this. The words arrived with the simple, devastating weight of something that had taken real courage to say. Not dramatic courage, not the loud, cinematic kind, but the quiet, private kind that costs something real. I closed the remaining distance between us. For the record, I said softly, warm disappointment was the funniest thing I had heard in years. She laughed. That laugh, brief, surprised, entirely unguarded, the same one that had rearranged something in me in her kitchen on a rainy night. Don't tell her that, Isabella said. She'll start workshopping material. I'd honestly love to meet her, I said. Something moved across her face then, deep and warm and unhurried. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, like something she had quietly hoped for had just been quietly confirmed. She'd like you, Isabella said softly. She has very little patience for people who aren't real. A pause. You're very real, Marcus. I reached out and took her hand. She looked down at it for a moment, both of us aware of the ordinary miracle of the gesture, the way the simplest things carry the most weight when they are finally, honestly meant. So, she said, looking back up at me. What happens now? Now, I said. I think we figure it out. Together, without the sofa. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. You are never going to let that go. Absolutely not, I confirmed. And there, in the plain morning light of an ordinary office, Isabella Marsh, the woman who had silenced boardrooms, managed crises, and spent years perfecting the art of needing no one, smiled. Not the careful, professional smile I had cataloged across 2 years of meetings, the real one, the one I had first seen in her kitchen, over cold tea and her mother's complaints, in the middle of a storm, the one, I suspected, I would spend a long time being grateful to have earned. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to choose between being safe and being real, then you already know what Isabella felt in that moment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories that remind you what real connection actually feels like. And drop a comment below telling me the one moment in this story that hit you the hardest. I read every single one.